Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this webinar on digital tools and using the hard-to-count map. As you know, Asian Americans Advancing Justice is working to ensure a full and accurate count of our communities in the 2020 census. As a national hub, we are working to develop curriculum and materials to support your Get Out the Count work, including fact sheets, toolkits, webinars, social media graphics, translated materials, and more. We have new Get Out the Count fact sheets, translated materials, and a community engagement and communications toolkit coming out next month in June. You can find all of our resources on our website at www.countusin2020.org. Again, that's www.countusin2020.org. As you may know, this webinar is the 9th installment of our monthly webinar series, which we launched in August 2018. If you missed our previous webinars and want to tune in, you can access them with the links on this slide. Our next webinar is taking place next month in June and will focus on Census Bureau outreach and partnerships and our new field and communications tools being released next month. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to Steve Romalewski. Steve joined the City University of New York in January 2006 to launch and direct the university's mapping service as a project of the Center for Urban Research in the Graduate Center, which specializes in online applications that provide intuitive access to powerful data sets, displayed visually through interactive maps and in other formats. We will have Q&A at the end of this webinar, and you can use the chat box or questions box to send your questions, or raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the question yourself. If you have questions during the presentation, please also use the chat box or questions box to send us your questions. This webinar is recorded and we will send out the recording and presentation after the webinar. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to Steve.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to talk about the online map that our team at the City University of New York Graduate Center developed in collaboration with the Coalition of Civil Rights Groups and Foundation supporters working for a fair and accurate census as a resource that organizations involved in census outreach and education locally across the country can use. And so I'll talk about the map and the things you can do with it now and some of our plans for that as a resource going forward through the actual 2020 enumeration. Before I do that, though, I wanted to, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, but I wanted to just provide some context about how the census does its enumeration for the decennial census and why that's important in the context of thinking of areas or populations as hard to count or not. So the first phase or operation the Census Bureau relies on is the self-response phase, where they send out mailings to virtually every household in the country with, this time for 2020, instructions on how to submit the census questionnaire responses either online or by phone, or to request a paper questionnaire. And that, and I should say also in 2010, that was pretty much all by mail. The Census Bureau actually mailed the paper questionnaire to almost all households in the country and asked people to mail it back. That self-response phase is critically important because the Census Bureau says that's where they get the most robust information. That's the easiest way for them to collect the information, and it's the most reliable results. But we know that not every household will self-respond for a variety of different reasons. And so if your household doesn't self-respond, the Census Bureau's charge is to count everyone, and they will therefore try to go out and talk to you in person. So the Census Bureau, this second or non-response follow-up phase, is when the Bureau hires a small army of people around the country as enumerators to knock on doors and enumerate people right there on the spot. That non-response follow-up phase is the time where there's the greatest risk that people will be not counted completely or counted inaccurately, and households will be counted inaccurately. And so that's where the concern about the undercount comes in, and the census not being fair and accurate. It's the most expensive part of the operation, and it's the riskiest in terms of trying to count people. So what we did in consultation with census experts, when we were trying to come up with a way of visualizing areas that might be harder to count than others, we looked back to the 2010 census and said, all right, let's just use a metric that indicates areas where there was the greatest share of households that did not self-respond, that therefore had to be counted in person, excuse me, and we'll consider those areas the hardest to count, or for shortcut, the hard to count communities. There are challenges in both phases, the self-response phase and the non-response follow-up phase. And so it's important to think about those in the context of using the map that we developed to plan your strategies and your outreach efforts. So certainly this proposal for a citizenship question, whether it's on the questionnaire or not, has raised concerns and fears. People might not want to self-respond because of that. They might not want to talk to an enumerator from the government coming to their doorstep during the non-response follow-up phase, and people might not answer that question either completely or for certain people in their households, and so the concern is that the information might be incomplete. People that have that don't speak English as their first language or have English language challenges might have trouble understanding the questionnaire instructions, whether it's online or otherwise. And also, if an enumerator comes to their doorstep that does not speak their language, there might be a challenge there. Because this census is the first digital census where you have an online option for everyone, there's a concern about people that don't have good internet access not being able to fill out the form online, and so all of these added challenges come into play. And so hopefully the information that we've included in our map, which I'll show in a second and go through in detail, will provide information to try to think through how to overcome those challenges and provide, not be the only thing that you use, but be one tool in your toolkit of ways to overcome those challenges. So we developed this map that shows those tracts, census tracts, highlights them in light orange to dark red, that had 25% or so or more households that did not self-respond to the census in 2010. So they did not mail back their forms. And so they had to be counted in person. And hopefully the census counted them completely and accurately. But we don't know that. And that was certainly uneven by population group and by geographic area. So that's the main thing that the map shows, and we're looking at a nationwide view. When we zoom in, you'll see that even though it looks right now, when you look at the nationwide view, that a good part of the Southwest and part of the South has a lot of those hard-to-count tracts. When you zoom in, you'll see a lot of urban areas that have concentrations of hard-to-count tracts as well, and suburban areas. They're everywhere around the country, more concentrated in some places, certainly, but it's a widespread thing. And I should point out that even if a tract is not color shaded on the map, that doesn't mean that there were very few tracts that had 100% self-response. So almost all tracts in the country had to have some households counted in person. And so there was at least some concern that people either may have been missed or counted inaccurately through that non-response follow-up. But the map highlights the areas where there was the greatest share of households that had to be counted in person, and so the greatest risk of being missed or counted inaccurately. The map that we've developed, which we launched in October of 2017 in direct partnership with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, is very much a work in progress. This screen shows you some of the main features that we have now, and we'll be adding new things to that, and in particular adding some features when the actual enumeration happens in the spring of 2020. So right now you can zoom around the map however you would zoom around any interactive map. You can click on the map and get more information, but in particular you can search for counties and zoom right to a county and get detailed information for a county. Do the same for each state. As well as congressional districts and state legislative districts, if you're planning outreach efforts to the people who are deciding how much funding the Census Bureau has and how much local funding is available for census outreach. And also you can type in an address or a zip code or a landmark or anything, and the map will zoom to that location and provide more information about that area. And I'll talk in a moment about in more detail about the types of information that you can use the map to identify. So we show all 72,000 or so tracts around the country, and not everyone knows what tract they're in, obviously, so we also show the ability to highlight zip codes and other types of geographies, but tracts are the convenient way of presenting information on the share of households that didn't mail back their forms in 2010, and so therefore will likely be hard to count again, and also to show other population characteristics for each local area. So this is a tract in Alameda County in California, just south of Oakland, and this is one of the scenarios that the organizers asked me to talk about, was how to identify concentrations of Asian American population in and around Oakland. And there were a number of other scenarios that people asked about. And so what I'm going to do is go through this one particular tract as an example of how you could use the map for any part of the country. And then also I'll talk about how you can download data from the map to do your own analysis. I'll continue with Alameda County, but also it will be consistent for any other part of the country that you want to focus on. So when you click on a tract in particular, but also any other geographic area, on the left, in that left-hand panel, where it says, will this tract be hard to count in 2020? So we highlight the share of households that mailed back their forms in 2010. This one is just under 66%, so a third of the households needed to be counted in person or door-to-door. On the right, where the legend is, where it says map overlays, you can use that to show other types of features on the map, and I'll talk about some of those in more detail in a moment. Excuse me. You can also see that we've added the locations of 16,000 or so public library branches around the country. Since the 2020 census will be digital, and public libraries, pretty much all of them have free Wi-Fi, and working with the American Library Association, who is also then working with local library systems around the country, they're very eager to have libraries viewed as a resource, a local community resource to help with the census, not only with education about the importance of the decennial census, but as a way for people that don't have good internet access at home to use their local libraries to provide their census questionnaire information that way. So we show where those are, where each library branch is, and some basic information about how to contact them. Going to the next slide, for each tract, again, we show information based on the latest American Community Survey estimates from the Census Bureau for the period of 2013 to 2017. A number of things. The first of which is on the left-hand panel where it says internet access, question mark. We show the share of households, according to the ACS, that don't have an internet subscription at home, and also the share of households that have a cell data plan only. So if you don't have internet access at home because the census is digital, and the Bureau is hoping that most households, if not all of them, submit their questionnaire information online, that's a challenge right away. And you may have a cell plan, but digital divide activists have pointed out that if you are paying as you go, you might not want to use your cell plan for anything other than absolutely essential services. So that might be a disincentive to filling out something like the census online. So if you see tracts that have large shares of households that don't have good internet access, that's a red flag right away that they will need additional outreach and assistance to figure out how to fill out the census questionnaire. Some tracts, I should point out, the Census Bureau is planning to send what they call an internet choice mailing to the households in those tracts that they expect won't have good internet access, where either they'll have the paper questionnaire directly or instructions about how to request a paper questionnaire. But still, it's a big unknown, and it's another challenge. And then looking at the left-hand panel on the screen, a little further down, populations at risk of being undercounted. And I'll go to the next slide where you could see that you can use this drop-down list to access information about each tract for a number of types of population groups. So people of color, kids under, whoops, jumped ahead. Hopefully we're back at that. So kids under 5, that was the population group that had the greatest net undercount rate in 2010. Renters, the Census Bureau considers renter households to be the main predictor of low self-response. Crowded households, single-parent households, immigrant populations, low-income, people with limited English proficiency, and people living in multifamily housing. All of these characteristics, separate from the 2010 mail return rate, are concerns that these groups either have historically been undercounted at higher rates than other population groups, or given the political climate and the controversies around the 2020 census, may not be willing to fill out the census questionnaire either on their own or certainly when a census enumerator comes to their doorstep. So we highlight information about each of these groups. And so I'll go through a couple of examples using this particular tract in Fremont. So I should actually, I'll go back. So right off the bat, 74% of the tract report their race as Asian, reported as alone or in combination with other races. So it's a more expansive definition or way of reporting the data. So it is more inclusive. Anyone who reported Asian on the census questionnaire in the 2013 to 2017 ACS is included in that number. And so you can see that's a pretty high percentage, and so that would be an area of concern. But we'll look in a moment, after I go through a couple of these slides, about how you can not just click on each tract, but also download data to do the analysis on your own and figure out areas where you would want to do outreach and organizing around, separate from or in addition to what the map is showing you now. So it's a high concentration of renters. You can see 80% of the tract's households are renter occupied. And I think there's about 6,000 or 7,000 people in this tract. 2/3 of them are foreign-born, and most of those since 2000, just under half since 2010, so recent immigrant population, again, because of the citizenship controversy and other issues around the census. That's a key population to focus on. And then people with limited English proficiency. Basically, if at least one person over a certain age does not speak English well, but speaks other languages, the Census Bureau considers that household to have limited English proficiency, and so it's language challenge. Sorry, these slides are jumping ahead on their own. So it's a concern in terms of trying to just right off the bat, understanding the instructions to fill out the questionnaire and filling out the questionnaire itself, whether it's online, by phone, or to request a paper questionnaire and mail it back. And so you can see most of the households in this tract that are considered limited English speaking households speak an Asian or Pacific Islander language. So you could use this to craft your strategies around outreach. So this kind of gives an overview of some of the things you can do with the interactive map now. If we have time and the technology is willing, we can do a quick demo, but I wanted to show at least some slides about what the map highlights. But let's go beyond the map. Recently we added a feature where you can download data, tract level data, the exact data that we use to power this map for your state and county, and link that to a GIS file and do your own mapping of that information, and also download a county level map that highlights each tract in the county with an Excel spreadsheet where you can compare the information for each tract, a printable feature where you can print the view that you're looking at anywhere in the country from the map, and some other options. So just to go through some of those, download the data, compare the data on the PDF map, link it to a GIS file, printing and sharing, and then I'll talk about some future enhancements we're planning to do with the map. So for each state, we provide a tract level Excel spreadsheet a link to a shapefile or a GIS file where you can map that tract level data for the entire state, or it also has county identifiers, so you can extract from that any county data you want. And then also for each county, a map in PDF format that shows each tract identified by tract number, where you can compare that with the Excel spreadsheet. And you could also go to the data download page, and we have a whole list of all the states, as well as a nationwide tract file, again, of the exact data that we're using in the map. So you could download that and analyze it and use it on your own to your heart's content. So this is an example of what a PDF map looks like, in this case for Alameda County, and you can see that each tract is labeled with the tract ID, and then you could also then download the Excel spreadsheet. And if you don't have GIS or any kind of other sophisticated technology or any other technology, you just have Excel or some version of Excel, you could look at the PDF map and look at the list of tracts in the Excel spreadsheet and sort them however you want, highlight them however you want, and then figure out where they are on the map, and then use that again to inform your outreach and organizing strategy. So that's one option to go beyond just the online map features. But then you could also, like I said, download the tract level Excel spreadsheet with a link to a shapefile from the Census Bureau of tract areas in the state, and you could separate out the counties. So what I did here is I did exactly that for Alameda County. And in this case, I used the Asian alone or in combination with other races column from the spreadsheet and created a map in ArcGIS. It doesn't have to be ArcGIS, it could be any GIS package, and showed where the concentrations are. The darker areas are 60% or 40 to 60% or more Asian population as a percent of total population. Again, based on the latest American Community Survey estimates, which the Census Bureau has its own version of what they call a low response map. I don't think even they have included the 2013 to 2017 ACS data yet. Then this shows where those concentration of Asian alone or in combination with other races populations are, or population concentrations are, compared with the hard-to-count tracts highlighted from the hard-to-count map. You could do that visually, or you could access the actual data layer we have from the hard-to-count map and overlay it with your map in your GIS package to see how they compare. And the tract we were looking at on the hard-to-count map slides is kind of in the middle of this map towards the bottom. It's this group of orange shaded tracts. And you can see that around that is a much more substantial concentration of Asian American population, which are not considered hard to count based on the 2010 mail return rate threshold, but again, might be for your local organizing purposes, areas that you want to focus on anyway, regardless of what happened in 2010, but simply because of the concentration of the particular population group you want to focus on. And so you could use that data to, again, go beyond what we have on the online map. I also then, in this slide, highlighted tracts where 15% or more of the households have no home internet access. That was kind of a threshold, arbitrary threshold that I used looking at the frequency distribution of the data. And so you can see how that overlays with the concentration of population of interest and where you want to then, again, plan your outreach. And then this next slide separately overlays the tracts that have a concentration of kids under 5 greater than the county median of 6.5%. So it shows you where there's greater concentration than typical throughout the county of children under 5. Again, children under 5 being the population group that had the greatest net undercount in the 2010 census and the population of keen interest. And you can see again how it overlaps with concentration of Asian American population. And then this last slide from the ArcGIS example that I put together using data that I downloaded from the hard-to-count map, you can see where the foreign-born population is, where more than a third of the population is foreign-born, which is the county median. So we're greater than average or greater than typical is throughout the county. So these are just some examples of what you can do downloading the data from the hard-to-count map. And so just to recap how to then put all of this together and thinking about your outreach strategies. So tracts that are highlighted on the map as hard-to-count tracts based on the share of households that mailed back their forms in 2010, because self-response is so important in terms of getting high-quality data and limiting the cost and the need for more complex, risky, non-response follow-up, really emphasizing to those households in those areas that, you know, they may not have mailed back the form in 2010, but we really need them to do it in 2020, where concentrations are of Asian American population, as an example of people of color, you know, historic undercounts that have caused those populations to have impacted political representation less than they should and resulted in unfair political representation during the redistricting process. That's a key talking point. Areas that have limited internet connectivity at the home, are there nearby public libraries? How can you work with those libraries to get the word out to those households that they can go to those libraries and fill out the census questionnaire there? Recent immigrant population, young children, et cetera. And again, to emphasize the importance of trusted voices and trusted partners. If you've been on earlier webinars, I'm sure you've heard that, but that's really key in terms of getting the word out to having people understand the importance of the census and the importance of participating either online or if a census enumerator comes to their doorstep. This is just one, this online map we've developed is just one resource among many that other organizations have put together. I highlight just a couple of them here. The Census Counts 2020 Coalition, the Census Project. The Census Bureau has their own mapping applications. I have a couple of them linked here. There are more. And again, if we have time, what do people think? I can go to the map if that would be helpful if people have any questions. But maybe before I do that, just to point out a couple of things we'll be adding to the online hard-to-count Census 2020 map. One thing we'll be including probably in the next week or two is at least beginning to include local, county, and statewide contacts. So anytime you zoom to the map and you're looking at a tract or a county or a city, among other things, you'll be able to see a list of what organizations are involved in census outreach and education. So if you're at a school and you want to know how to get more involved in these other groups, or you just happen to be looking at the map in general and you're not that too aware of who else is doing what, you'll be able to hopefully more easily get connected to other networks. We'll be highlighting the tracts that will be receiving bilingual questionnaires. The Census Bureau will be mailing out to certain tracts mailings with instructions in Spanish as well as English. I think they're only going to do that with Spanish and English, and then they'll have other languages, or they'll have the instructions and the questionnaire in other languages through the online website to fill out the questionnaire and with other materials. But we'll be adding information about that. And then thinking ahead to the actual enumeration in spring of 2020, when the mailings start to go out and people start to respond, the Census Bureau tells us they'll be publishing daily information down to the census tract level on the share of households that have self-responded. And so just like we did in 2010, we'll be adding information to the hard-to-count online map that will highlight the tracts that are doing well, that are not doing well, and organizations will be able to hopefully use that to fine-tune in real time their local outreach and education efforts, their get out the count efforts. And when the self-response phase ends, we'll keep that information on the online hard-to-count map. So as the Census Bureau then sends out enumerators during the non-response follow-up phase, local organizations will be able to get a sense of which communities will likely be getting more enumerators and fewer, and again, how to fine-tune your outreach during the non-response follow-up phase for areas that will need assistance and support the most. So I urge you to use the map. We would love to hear any feedback you have about the map. Is it helpful? Are there other things we can add? Are there things that are not that useful on the application? I encourage you to include links to the map if you can to help get the word out and get it in more people's hands that are looking at it online. You can embed the map into your website, and you can also, I didn't mention this, but you can, when you're looking at, you've zoomed to the area and you've turned on or off different map layers and you've highlighted different information, you can then create a customizable link that you can share that will zoom to that exact spot and show that exact amount of information that you were just looking at, which you can share on Facebook and Twitter, etc. And so hopefully that will be helpful in getting the word out about the resource and about how it could be used now during planning for the Get Out the Count efforts, and then during the actual Get Out the Count efforts. So I'll leave it at that. If people have questions, we can ask questions, and if it would be helpful, I can go to the actual map and see what it looks like.
Hi, we have one question from Gina Gallo. Do you think you could talk about how to use the HTC and Roam maps together?
Sure. So the Census Bureau's Roam, R-O-A-M map, I think it stands for Response Outreach Mapper, is an effort by the Bureau to highlight areas. It has a similar purpose to highlight areas that will likely be hard to count in 2020. The Census Bureau, leading up to the 2010 census, the Census Bureau published a hard-to-count score for each census tract where they combined population and housing characteristics and said, all right, these tracts, based on those characteristics, will be harder to count or not. We used that information in a similar mapping application we created in 2010 for the 2010 census. The Census Bureau, after that, decided no longer to publish the hard-to-count scores, and instead to come up with a statistical model that would try to predict where there would be, or which tracts would have large shares of households not self-responding to the census. And we looked at the low response score model and the low response scores themselves when we were developing the hard-to-count map, and we decided not to use those because we thought it would be more reliable to show or to use the actual self-response rates from the 2010 census as the metric for areas that are considered hard to count. We're continuing to evaluate the low response scores and the information the Census Bureau has put together, but they're still a little behind in terms of not using the latest census estimates and not incorporating things like internet access yet. So we'll see if it makes sense to include that information in some way. We may very well do that in iterations of the hard-to-count map between now and the 2020 enumeration. So the Roam map, you'll see that there are similar patterns. They provide probably some more information in terms of demographic or population characteristics that from the earlier 2012 to 2016 American Community Survey. They present it in a big long list for each tract or area that you click on the map. So if you can wade through that and pull that information out, that could be very helpful. And they also do allow you to download that data by area, not just for the state, but you can zoom into a local area and just get the data for just the tracts you're looking at. You kind of have to know how the census data works and how all the census variables are described to really make good use of that, but that could be very helpful. And so I would definitely suggest looking at both and kind of triangulating between both of them and your local knowledge of the areas that you're focused on, and see which ones, where the overlap is and where tracts might be highlighted on the Roam map and not on the hard-to-count map, and vice versa, and dig a little deeper and see why that is and what information is there you can pull from both maps to really well inform your outreach strategies.
We have another question from Hongmei Ping. This is a very helpful tool, and we have been using this to guide our work on the ground. Can you share how the data interface / maps would interact with the imputation process, and if and how the HTC map can be used as a predictor for imputation monitoring?
Well, so imputation is when the Census Bureau sees that a household did not self-respond, and then they send an enumerator to that household, and after a certain number of attempts at trying to reach that household, they can't for whatever reason, and they also look at administrative data and try to understand what the population is for that household, and if that doesn't work, they will try to impute the number of people living there and the characteristics of the people living in that household based on a model or an algorithm that the Bureau uses. I don't know exactly what that algorithm is, but generally speaking, my understanding is they look at neighboring housing units and see what the characteristics are for those and impute those characteristics to the household that they couldn't talk to. Excuse me. And so that's part of the non-response follow-up phase. I don't know, though, this is something I'll need to think about a little bit more. So the plan is that we'll be publishing and incorporating into the hard-to-count map the tract-by-tract self-response rates that the Census Bureau says they'll be publishing in March and April of 2020. And so you'll be able to see during the self-response phase, and then once the self-response phase is done, which tracts had, X% or high rate of households that self-responded, and which ones had a relatively low rate of households that self-responded. And so those tracts or those communities that had a lot of households that did not self-respond, they're going to need a lot more of the non-response follow-up where census enumerators are going to go out to. The imputation process, I understand, happens later. But I think, at the very least, you'll be able to gauge which tracts or which communities will need the most door-to-door enumeration. We don't know yet if the Bureau will be publishing anything about the success of the non-response follow-up phase. I guess if they do, we'll be able to talk with census experts about how to make sense of that information and incorporate it into the map, but I'm not sure that will be possible. So I guess at least you'll have some information based on the real-time self-response rates that we'll be adding to the map about areas that will need the most non-response follow-up, therefore the areas that will be most at risk of people getting missed and will be needing imputation. I don't know how more fine-tuned it will be beyond that. But I will definitely think about that more, and I'll talk to others and see if we can plan for that more, precise way of understanding where the imputation will be needed. I don't make any promises, but I'll I'll take a look at it. I'll think about it more. I hope that's at least somewhat helpful.
Thank you, Steve. And if you want to take us to the maps, I think participants would love to see you go to the actual maps and then walk through it, the demo. Thank you.
Let me see if I can. So now you should be looking at the map. And there was a question that people had about the Mississippi Delta area. Maybe I'll zoom in on that. That people were asking about beforehand about a scenario of looking at that area. So one thing is, as you move your mouse, or if you're on a tablet or a smaller device, as you move your finger or pointer over the map, you'll see in the left-hand panel that for each tract in the country, we provide a quick snapshot of what the mail return rate was in 2010, and therefore how many households, the share of households that needed to be counted in person. Then you can zoom in on the map and see the counties and the tracts within them, and I'll click on one tract along the Mississippi in Bolivar County. So you can see that there's almost 3,300 people living there, actually a little over based on the number of people living in group quarters. It had just under a 60% mail return rate in 2010, so 40% of the households needed to be counted in person. Hopefully they all did and were counted accurately. We'll see. We don't know that, rather. We also show for each tract and for each county and overall how people will be enumerated. So this section here, the type of enumeration, the Census Bureau, as I mentioned, will be sending mailings to virtually all households around the country, but some areas will have those mailings or the instruction packet dropped off by a census enumerator. And in some areas, mainly in rural Maine and Alaska, the households will be counted in person right from the start. There won't be any mailing, there won't be anything dropped off. So this shows that for this particular tract we're looking at, just over a quarter of the households will get the mailing with instructions about how to fill out the census questionnaire, but 3/4 of the tract will have that instruction packet dropped off to them. So that also can help inform your outreach strategies. So if you're working in an area where there's going to be a lot of that so-called, the Census Bureau calls that update leave, where an enumerator drops off an instruction packet in person at the household's doorstep, you can do work ahead of time to make sure that households in that area know to expect that, and not to look in the mail, but to look in their doorstep or in their mailbox or something. I should point out also that on the right-hand legend here for the map, we have this section about map overlays. You could also display the type of enumeration area on the map, so you can see within each tract the areas that will receive this, areas highlighted in yellow receiving the update leave. So let's zoom to that particular tract. And so you can see the areas that are highlighted in dark yellow will be the households that will be getting the mailing, the instruction packet delivered to them, not mailed to them. And then scrolling down a little further, so out of the 1,100 households in this tract, 60% of them reported on the American Community Survey that they don't have home internet access. So that's a substantial percentage. It's possible that both with the update leave and also the tracts or the households in the tract that will get mailings, they may get the actual paper questionnaire to begin with, because the Census Bureau will be using this information about the share of households that don't have internet access as one factor to determine whether they mail the actual or drop off the actual paper questionnaire or an instruction packet about how to fill out the information online. So this is something to maybe coordinate with your local census office to make sure you understand for this particular area who will be getting what. We have requested from the Census Bureau that they tell us ahead of time how or where those so-called internet choice mailings will happen, where people will get the actual questionnaire rather than an instruction packet on how to go online. We don't know if we're going to get that information. If we do, we will certainly include it on the map so you'll be able to see that at a glance for each tract and also what the statistics are on a county-wide level. So again, you'll be able to use that. And you can also show, excuse me, I'm going to check this box for the 2020 area census office information. So this particular tract is, you can see this in green labeled on the map, coordinated through the Jackson area census office that the Census Bureau has. And if we zoom out a little bit, you can see how far that Jackson area census office extends. So it's a pretty large area of Mississippi. And But so if you're doing work in that area and you have questions about how the census enumeration will take place, that's one place to reach out to, and they might then direct you to more local census offices or census resources, but you would contact them. And then going further down on the left-hand panel, so for this particular tract, so 90% of the population reported their race as Black, either alone or in combination with other races. And then you can see for each of these other so-called populations at risk of being undercounted, the share of population, so 10% kids under 5, half of the households are renter-occupied, almost 30% of the households are single-parent households. Thinking about that, people with priorities that may not include filling out the census questionnaire, whether it's online or not. So, this area, even if they did have good internet access, if you're, a single parent taking care of your kids, census questionnaire online or otherwise is not top of mind. So that again is information to factor into your census outreach and education. Almost half of the tract the population of the tract has income levels below the poverty level, and another 30% have incomes that are near the poverty level. So it's a relatively low income tract, and that's a concern in terms of correlated with education levels and making sure the instructions that the Census Bureau provides are easily understood, and also again, thinking about how day-to-day priorities may conflict with or get in the way of filling out the census form. So more information to factor into your outreach. Let's see, and so this tract has no limited English-speaking households, although some portion of the population living in multifamily housing units. Also, the Census Bureau says that renters and living in multifamily housing are highly correlated with low self-response. So let's say you then want to bring this particular map with information about that tract to a community organizing meeting. You can click on the print icon at the top of the map and then send this exact map with the information about the tract we were just looking at to your printer, or print it to copy it to a PDF, export it to a PDF, and then share that. And if you realized, oh wait, I don't want to highlight people living in multifamily housing for the printed version, I want to highlight renters. So you could just, within this print layout, change the type of information you're looking at, and then that will be printed. And again, you can share the link to the map directly to different social media, or share that and email it to people, or include it on your website. And then also on this little pop-up window here, this is where you would access the shapefiles and this Excel spreadsheets for each state in the country, and the national file, a list of other census resources that you can access, and then if you have questions about how the map works, you can access this, about finding out how to use the map with some screenshots, and then a description about what does it mean to be hard to count, why that's important, and different ways of measuring hard to count. We also talk here about the Census Bureau's low response scores and other characteristics. And then if you're interested, some details about how we developed the mapping application. So that's just to point out some of the other resources that are available.
Steve, there's two questions, one from Bonzi Vu. Is there a source to find tracts by city instead of county? And the second question is from Leslie Potts. For the people whose responses were estimated by enumerators instead of manually filled out, is there data on how many people in each tract had data entered this way?
So the first question, we have not yet included information by city. We could, and maybe we'll do that because people have asked for that. The tracts are not always, they don't always line up with city boundaries, so we have to do some estimating ourselves about how to allocate the tract data specifically to calculate a mail return rate for the city, but maybe we don't need to do that. Maybe we'll just download the city level data from the Census Bureau about the populations at risk of being counted and provide that information by city, because that definitely would be helpful. We do show on the map, you can display zip code boundaries, and you can see how zip codes don't line up with anything, but sometimes people do want to use zip codes to understand where tracts are and sort of how to do the organizing. So we at least added that, but maybe we'll also include cities. So I appreciate that question. We'll see if we can incorporate that. And then the information on the number of people that were estimated. So the Census Bureau does publish information from 2010, the 2010 census, about the what they call the imputation statistics, but not at the local level. They only have that information at best for large counties. Actually, no, I'm wrong about that. I just remembered that they do publish information at the tract level for certain types of imputations. So that information does potentially exist, and I guess it's a gauge of where it's been the tracts that are really the hardest to count, because those are households that not only did not self-respond, but also did not respond to a census enumerator for whatever reason, and therefore had to be counted by this imputation process. So I'm sorry, there is that information at the tract level from the 2010 census.
Thank you. And we have one question from Elsa Obuchowski that we can answer. So the Census Bureau doesn't mail to PO boxes. What happens to households that have only a PO box address?
Yeah, so this is something that we can actually take. So the Census Bureau has this process called update leave. So during this operation, a census staff will drop off self-response materials, including paper questionnaires and directions on how to respond online or on the phone during the infield addressing canvassing operation. So the update leave operation will happen in areas where the majority of housing units do not have mail physically delivered, or their mail delivery information is not verifiable. So that's about 10 million homes, or 7% of the nation's total.
All right. Any more questions? I see one comment to look at New Mexico. Steve, if you can zoom into some of the information in New Mexico.
So as you can see, so just under half of New Mexico's population lives in tracts that are considered hard to count based on the 2010 mail return rate. Also, I should point out that you'll see these tracts like this one that are highlighted with cross-hatching. And so those tracts from 2010 do not have a mail return rate because no households in that tract received a mailing. They were enumerated or counted directly in person right from the start. And if the tract or an area did not have typical addresses, or was very rural otherwise, or had a big seasonal population, the Census Bureau just counted those areas in person directly. So even though they don't have a mail return rate that we can use to color shade on the map, we're considering them hard to count just because, by the nature of how they were enumerated. Most of these areas will be included, so this one is pretty much all yellow based on the 2020 type of enumeration. So it looks like all of the households in that particular tract will be having information dropped off at the doorstep about how to fill out the form either online, by phone, or by mail. But again, let's go back to the state. So you can see that here are some of the statistics for each of these populations at risk of being undercounted on a statewide basis. Immigrant population, low income population, limited English proficiency. And for each state, we also provide a PDF map. So I'll click on this link and hopefully you'll be able to see this. Whoop. So here's what the PDF map of New Mexico looks like with each county labeled. And also we show on the map, you have the option of displaying on the map where tribal lands are of different types. And so you can see a lot of the areas that were counted through the so-called update enumerator, in-person enumeration in 2010 overlap with tribal lands. And a lot of those areas will have the instructions for how to fill out the 2020 census dropped off to them instead of mailed. And then this reminds me also to go back to another feature, excuse me, of the hard-to-count map, which is, I mentioned this, but you can also search for congressional district information or search for information by congressional district as well as state legislative districts. So you could either search, or when you're on the map and you've clicked on the map and selected an area, you can use these options at the top left next to the map to highlight this is Senate district, Assembly district, or State House district, as well as congressional districts. And then you could also type in not just the congressional district number, but the name of the congressional district representative in that search box, if you don't remember the number or know the number, and it will zoom directly to that particular district.
All right, and we have a hand raised, so we are going to unmute the line for Hong Mei Peng. If you'd like to ask your question, you can do so now.
1 second.
Hong Mei Peng, if you have your hand raised, your line is unmuted and you can ask your question. All right, then we're going to move to a different question. Actually, Steve, if you can show us the overlay of the reservation information with the map that you currently have up, that'd be really helpful.
Sure. I don't think there are any tribal lands in this particular part of New York City. But I'll go back to, so I clicked on to show tribal lands. I'll go back to New Mexico. And so you could see that this area that abuts Arizona, the Navajo Nation, the tract we were looking at in New Mexico, the Mescalero Reservation. So there's no information specifically to tribal lands that we display, but we display just for reference purposes where they are. So you could, again, use that as you're navigating the map to understand how that overlaps with hard-to-count tracts or other information.
Thank you. I see we have a few more questions, and we're going to unmute the lines for the people who are asking the questions. All right, so I see Leslie Potts has a few questions. Leslie, we've unmuted your line if you'd like to ask your questions.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to know if there was any way to get data on how many enumerators are available by phone per state, or if that's not available per state nationally.
I'm sorry, you said how many what?
How many enumerators or support will be available from the phone line? I'm not exactly sure if it's separated by state for folks to call?
I don't know offhand. Presumably the Census Bureau local offices or area census offices will have that information. Or the regional census offices might know that. I don't know that offhand. I don't know if the Bureau will be publishing that, but we can ask.
Okay, would your best advice be to contact my respective regional offices for that
Yes.
information?
Yeah, I'm assuming it's part of the census operational plan, so I'm assuming the regional offices would know best.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and then I think we have a few questions from Judith Williams. So Judith, we are going to unmute your line if you'd like to ask your questions.
Hello?
Muted if you'd like to ask your question. Your line is unmuted if you'd like to ask your question.
I think I got the answer. The crosshatched areas of New Mexico and Arizona are areas where they just send enumerators. They don't bother because there's no internet and no phone and no set addresses.
Well, not exactly. So the areas that are crosshatched are areas that in 2010 were counted in person. There was no mailing to them. So we don't
Right.
have a mail return rate we can use to then
Right.
color shade those areas. In
Yeah.
2020, it's a little different. So if we show the type of enumeration area, so all of that area of Arizona and New Mexico that was crosshatched, where the Flagstaff ACO is, and that's all part of the update leave enumeration operation for 2020, which means that pretty much all of the households in those areas shaded yellow on the map will be getting instructions on how to fill out the census questionnaire dropped off at their household. So they won't get a mailing, it'll be dropped off.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. And within that, there's also the question of whether they will get the actual paper questionnaire if the Census Bureau determines that the area has such poor internet access that it's not worth asking them to go online, or if they will actually get instructions on how to go online. We don't know which area is which yet, but we've asked for that information. And if we get that, we'll try to incorporate that in a useful way in the online map.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. And we have one question from Summer Star. How do I search for a tract number?
So we don't have that feature yet, but that is something we've been thinking about. Not only how do you search for a tract, but also search for and highlight tracts based on population characteristics. But I'm assuming that not everyone will know a tract number, and they'll, searching by area or county is fine. But some people certainly will have specific tracts that they're interested in. So we're thinking about how best to incorporate that. So we'll keep you posted. In the interim, though, you can download for each state or nationwide the list of tracts in Excel format, and you can look at the tract data that way. And if you know which county it's in, so if we look at a county map, let's pick this particular county here, McKinley County in New Mexico, you can click the map of McKinley County, and let's see if I can show that for everyone. So this is what the PDF map looks like. So each tract is labeled. And so if you knew the tract ID within the county, you could use this to figure out exactly where it is. Along those lines, I've also been thinking if we can add tract labels to the online map so you could see which tract is which, especially now that we have the downloadable Excel files. So we're thinking about that as well. I hope that helps. like I said, it's a work in progress. So we really appreciate the feedback and the questions.
Thank you. So I think we're at the end of our time, but if folks have follow-up questions, we'll share everyone's emails so you can connect with Steve directly. And then also as a reminder, there'll be a recording of the webinar circulated afterwards. So you'll see the presentation and the webinar again.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate it. And yes, please feel free to email me if you have questions.
Great. So as a reminder, this is part of our monthly webinar series. We have new webinars planned throughout the summer, with the next one taking place in June, focused on field and communications and Census Bureau outreach and partnerships. Thank you so much for joining us today. On this slide, you'll see our contact information as well as our website, www.countisin2020.org. And then again, as a reminder, we'll circulate this presentation as well as contact information and a recording of the webinar following today. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Steve, for your presentation.
Thank you.